once again, good evening to everyone. My name is Adeyemi Aremu. I'm the current president of South African Association of Botany. Firstly, we really apologize for the short delay. One of our colleagues was running late, so we apologize about that. I want to welcome all of you to today's webinar, which is our last one for the year. And we actually appreciate your presence here. But my job today is just to welcome you. I will actually hand over quickly to Anina because we are running late to officially welcome Anton Pauw, who is going to be our presenter today. Anina, thank you so much. I heard you were having a bit of a challenge. Welcome. Can you take over? Thank you, Anina.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for welcoming everybody.
Can't hear you.
Okay, let me try that.
Elizabeth, can you confirm? Can you hear?
Can you hear me?
Is it just me?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, Anina. Anton, can you hear Anina?
I can hear you too, Anina, yes.
Elizabeth, can you hear?
Yes, so I think it's you, Adeyemi.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Proceed.
Okay, thank you. Welcome everybody to our last SAAB webinar for the year. We've had some really interesting talks this year, and today we'll be hearing from one of our silver medalist SAAB silver medalist winners, and it's yes, I'll do the house rules later, right? So please allow me to welcome Anton. Anton Pauw is from Stellenbosch University, studied at University of Cape Town, started with bee pollination, and has been making great work in the field of pollination, ecology and evolution and conservation in different parts of South Africa, which he'll be telling us about. And besides his great contribution to botany in the botanical sciences, he also makes a big contribution in terms of conservation and community engagement, which hopefully he'll tell us about some of that project as well. But yes, I'm not going to take more time and rather let Anton get a start. Just some general things, and please remember to keep your microphone and video off during the webinar, but you can add questions in the chat box or just raise a hand at the end of the talks, and then we'll have time for questions at the end, but you can also add them during the talk if you want to just make a note to remind yourself about your question. And then if you want to receive SACNASP points for attending the webinar, then please, Elizabeth, I think they should add their name and SACNASP in the chat box for that.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. So just remember that. And I hope I didn't forget anything. I think that's all we need for now. Right, so please, we'll take your questions at the end. Anton, please, I see your screen is shared, so everything seems set up, so you may start. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anina and Adeyemi, for that introduction. Can you guys hear me and see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic, great. So if at any stage in the presentation I sneeze, it's because it's springtime in the Cape and I'm a bit allergic to pollen. Incidentally, also allergic to honeybee stings. But all the same, it's a great pleasure to be able to speak about pollination today and the conservation of plants in the Cape region. So the Cape region of South Africa, which is located here at the tip of Africa, as you know, is one of these Mediterranean climate regions of the world, which are located between 30 and 40 degrees on the west coasts of continents. These regions find themselves in the Hadley cell during the summer months, Easterly winds bring rain to the east coast of the continents, but it leaves the west coast of the continents dry. Just find a pointer here. There we go. In the winter months, these regions find themselves in the feral cell, as you can see here, and the feral cell with the westerly winds then brings rain during the winter months. So if you look at a rainfall map like this of South Africa, which shows the ratio of winter to summer rainfall, you see that the ratio is very biased towards winter rainfall in the western parts of the continent. In fact, as much as 4 times the rainfall falls in the winter compared to the summer months. So very much a Mediterranean climate region. This extreme seasonality is, of course, one of the reasons why you get fires in the summer months on a rotation cycle of about 5 to 15 years. The region is also renowned for its extremely nutrient-poor soils, especially those that are derived from sandstone, as you can see in the foreground here. These soils are very poor in phosphorus. So given these environmental conditions, it's perhaps surprising that the Cape is extremely diverse in terms of plant species, with as many as 11,400 plant species in the Greater Cape Floristic region, which is indicated in the map top right, and extremely high levels of endemism. 78% of the plant species occur only within the Cape Floristic region. One example of this diversity is the oil-secreting orchids. They are in the clade called the Coracini, it's subtribe Coracini. And here you can see some of them. There are as many as 100 species in this clade. And this is pretty typical of the diversity in the Cape, in the sense that the Cape diversity is composed of relatively few clades, but each of those clades is diversified into many species. Another striking feature of the Cape is that the plant-pollinator relationships are very specialized. On the left in the slide, you can see a plant-pollinator network, which we produced for a hectare of land in the Cederberg. And you can calculate the degree of specialization in a network like that using a metric called delta H2 prime. Basically, it tells you how specialized the relationships are between plants and pollinators, essentially how many pollinators there are for a plant and how many plants are visited by an animal species. And you can see when we compare those values for the Cape with networks from across the world, as shown on the map, you can see that the Cape is an extreme outlier, has very highly specialized plant-pollinator interactions compared with the rest of the world. One example of these specialized relationships is that between the oil-secreting orchid, Pterygodium catholicum, and the oil-collecting bee, Rediviva perengay. It's the only species that pollinates this orchid. The orchid secretes oil, and the bee collects that oil with plumose hairs on its front legs, which soak up the oil. It feeds the oil to its larvae, and it also lines the inside of its nest cells with the oil to waterproof them. Of course, in the process, the orchid very precisely attaches its pollen packets to the basal tarsus of the middle legs of the bee, and so is pollinated. Unfortunately, another striking feature of the Cape is the high concentration of species of conservation concern. So this is data from the Red List of South Africa, and you can see where all the rare species are concentrated. There are as many as 3,200 species of conservation concern in the fynbos alone. Here I've put a face to some of these rare and endangered species. The one on the left is the oil-secreting orchid, Pterygodium cruciferum, but others are proteas and ericas, for example. Some are extinct in the wild already. So following that introduction, I want to attempt to answer 3 questions about the Cape. Why is the flora so diverse? How do human activities threaten the flora? And what solutions are there? I'm going to attempt to answer these questions from the perspective of pollination, and there are 2 reasons for that. The first is that pollinators are potentially a strong selective force operating on plants by selecting amongst individual plants. They can drive the evolution of plants. And secondly, pollinators are important for seed production. So in that sense, they are important for the persistence of plant populations. Let's start with this idea that pollinators might be important in explaining the diversity of Cape plants. And we're going to attempt to test that idea using a phylogeny for the oil-secreting orchids, which I've introduced already. There are about 100 species in that clade. We produced a phylogeny for them, and then following very extensive field work, we mapped the pollinators onto that phylogeny, and they are indicated by the symbols of various colors and shapes here. As you can see, they are all Rediviva bee species, all oil-collecting bees in the same genus, but you can see there are a few species that are involved. And a striking feature of this phylogeny is that closely related species, let's say, for example, these three here, tend to have different pollinators. So this would suggest then that shifts in pollinator are important in the speciation process. It's adaptation to pollinators potentially, which produces new orchid species. But you will also notice that there are some parts of the phylogeny, for example, let's say over here, where we are finding a group of species that are closely related but have the same pollinator. And we wondered what was going on there. How are they reproductively isolated if they are sharing the same pollinator? So the answer is that these bees, although they visit several orchid species, nevertheless do not transfer pollen between species, because each orchid places its pollen in a very precise part of the bee's body. And in that way, these species, although they share the same pollinator, can still be reproductively isolated from each other. This is the oil-collecting bee known as the Renosterveld oil-collecting bee, Rediviva perengay, and this group of plants all have it as its only pollinator. So when we take both of these possibilities into consideration, the possibility that sister species might have different pollinators, or they might have different attachment sites on the same pollinator, we see that even in cases such as this, where the pollinator was the same species, you can see that different parts of the bee are involved, or alternatively, as in this case down here, different pollinators are involved. And then we can test that idea statistically by randomly reallocating pollinators to plants and also pollen attachment sites to plants, and ask, in these randomizations, how often do closely related species have either different pollinators or different attachment sites? And that's what this little image or histogram over here shows you. You can see that in about 20% or 0.2, 20% of the cases in the randomizations, sister species have either different pollinators or different attachment sites, whereas the observed is much higher. 60% of the sister species pairs in reality have different pollinators or attachment sites, suggesting strongly that it is this change in mode of pollination that is involved during the speciation process. That was an examination of the pattern produced by this form of adaptation. But what's the actual mechanism? The mechanism by which plants might evolve new pollinators is encapsulated in the broader theory known as the Grant-Stebbings model. So Grant and Stebbings imagined, first of all, that pollinators were distributed in what they call geographical mosaic. In other words, they had non-overlapping distribution ranges. And it looks as if these Rediviva bees shown here fulfill that requirement. So the Renosterveld oil-collecting bee, for example, occurs here in the lowlands. The giant oil-collecting bee, Rediviva gigas, which is the red markers, occurs in the fynbos in the mountains. And so we very typically then see that these oil-collecting bees have non-overlapping distribution ranges, which fulfills the first requirement of Grant and Stebbings' model for pollinator-driven speciation. The second part of the story is that they imagine that, for example, an orchid, which has very widely dispersed seeds, would disperse into a new region where it encounters a new pollinator. In that new region, it will adapt to the new pollinator. Its morphology, maybe its scent and color will change. And through that adaptation, it magically or automatically becomes reproductively isolated from its sister species. And so this idea is that adaptation and the origin of reproductive isolation occur in this single step. And in this way, pollinators might be very potent drivers of plant speciation. We wanted to test whether indeed orchids are adapted to the local pollinator. And to do that, we reciprocally transplanted these very closely related sister species pairs between different regions. So if we take the first example here, which is Pterygodium catholicum, we see that at home, in other words, in the Renosterveld, where the bee that pollinates it occurs, it's this bee, Rhodoviva perengay, well, its pollination rate is almost 80%. But if we transplant it into the fynbos, where a different bee occurs, it gets basically ignored, and its pollination rate is basically 0. We see the same pattern for its very close sister species. In fact, it's still an undescribed species. We're still calling it the late flowering form of Pterygodium catholicum. But if you transplant this form into the Renosterveld, where Rhodoviva perengay occurs, it doesn't do very well. But back at home in the fynbos, where Rhodoviva gygas occurs, it does very well. So this pattern, which you can see is repeated for at least 3 sister species pairs, very strongly suggests local adaptation to the local pollinator, as Grant and Stebbings would have suggested in their pollinator-driven speciation model. The highly specialized plant-pollinator relationships that we see in the Cape also allowed us to consider the possibility of co-evolution. In other words, not just adaptation by plants to pollinators, but simultaneously adaptation by pollinators to plants. And this idea originated with Darwin, who was examining very long-spurred Malagasy orchids. And he imagined the process as follows. He imagined that longer tubed flowers would always be at a selective advantage because they would be best fertilized. And that's because the pollinator is straining to reach the nectar in the bottom of the flower. And in the process, it makes very good contact with the reproductive parts of the flower, which are located at the entrance to the floral tube. And so these longer tube flowers will produce more seed, will export more pollen, and will be at a selective advantage. But simultaneously, the pollinators are being selected for having longer proboscises because a pollinator with a long proboscis can always drain all the nectar from the flower, whereas the one with a shorter proboscis, as shown here, can't reach all the nectar in the bottom of the tube. So with these two processes happening simultaneously, we get a sort of a red queen race where the adaptive landscape is moving with the species that's trying to adapt to it. So this was Darwin's idea, and he proposed it for the interaction between Malagasy orchids and Malagasy moths. But those two species are both very rare, and they're nocturnal and difficult to work on. So we wondered whether we could test the idea using long proboscis flies and long tube flowers. And we did that here in the Sandveld on the west coast, one of the few little fragments of vegetation that's left under the power lines because it's an ESCOM servitude, and so it doesn't get plowed up. And we wanted to quantify the benefits to the fly and simultaneously the benefits to the flower derived from a single interaction between a fly and a flower, and relate that to the traits of the fly and the traits of the flower. And this is the very high-tech experimental setup. We had flowers in a little tube on the end of a 2-meter-long stick, and we would present those flowers to a fly that was busy feeding in a population. We would hope that that fly would move over onto the experimental flowers and would visit those flowers. And then immediately we would remove the stigma of the flower and see how much pollen did it receive from that interaction, how well was it fertilized. Hopefully, Richard Waterman would manage to catch the fly, and then we'd be able to also measure the tongue length of the fly. So we have the tongue length of the fly, we have the tube length of the flower, both of those traits. We have the benefit to the flower, which is the amount of pollen received. The benefit to the fly was a bit more tricky to calculate. You want to know how much nectar did it get during that interaction. And to do that, we backlit the flowers with a strong flashlight and marked the nectar level inside the tubes with a felt nib pen. And then after the visit by the fly, we checked again how much of the nectar dropped by. And so we could calculate how much nectar did the fly get from that interaction. So we have the benefit to the fly and to the flower and the traits of the interacting species. And then to test Darwin's idea, which is that the fitness of both the plant and the pollinator depends very much on where they are in this race for elongation. We attempted to present the data like you can see here as a difference between the traits. So it's about the relative position in the race, not so much about the absolute tongue length or the absolute tube length, but are you winning? So 0 on the x-axis here is parity. It's the point at which tongue length equals tube length. Values to the right of 0, the positive values, 10, for example, indicates that tongue length is 10 millimeters longer than tube length. So it's tongue length minus tube length. And if the fly is winning, the values are positive. Here, the fly is winning by 20 millimeters. But to the left of 0, the flower is winning. So here, the flower is winning by 20 millimeters. So how does this fitness difference, this trait difference relate to the fitness of these two species? Let's consider first the pollinators, which are shown with the black markers. The fitness for the fly would, be difficult to measure in its entirety, but we just measured nectar consumption, which surely should translate into more activity by the fly, perhaps into greater chance in obtaining mates, maybe laying more eggs. So it's a proxy for fitness. But as you can see, when the proboscises are longer than the tubes or the flowers, in other words, on the right of the 0 line, the flies are receiving maximal benefit. The markers are all up here. And when the proboscis is shorter than the tube, the flies are really suffering, often getting no nectar at all. The situation is similar for the plants. When the plants are winning the race, which is over here, they're very well fertilized, receiving many or maximal pollen grains. And when they are losing the race over here, they're receiving very little or sometimes no pollen. So this is then very strong evidence that, in fact, Darwin's mechanism of coevolution is possibly occurring. And of course, that mechanism is much more widely applicable beyond pollination to things like interaction between humans and viruses, where there's adaptation by both partners in that interaction. You can see that that process potentially leads to reciprocal adaptation here in the fly and the flower. So you get this incredible range of variation in proboscis length and tube length in the flies and the flowers across the landscape. Down here in the south, the proboscis and the tubes are very short, and further in the north, we're getting greatly elongated traits. We're not entirely sure what drives these differences. We know that extreme elongation of proboscis and tube is driven by coevolutionary processes, but why should it be limited to a lower trait value in the south and in the north? Potentially it has something to do with wind speed, but we're not sure. It's much windier down here in the south, and surely at some point it's going to become impossible to get an extremely long proboscis into a flower, especially during windy conditions. And we did observe that in the field, that the flies really struggle as the wind picks up. So up until now, I've spoken about how pollinators can contribute to the diversity of the Cape by generating new species. But in order to explain the diversity of the Cape, you need to explain not only how diversity originates, but also how it can be maintained. In other words, how many species can live together in a community. So this is a community ecology question rather than an evolutionary question. There's been quite a lot of recent development in the theory of ecological communities, especially by Chesson and his so-called modern coexistence theory. One of the take-home messages of that set of theory is that something called negative frequency dependent selection is really important in maintaining diversity within communities. And that's illustrated here. The purple and the orange flowers are two different species, and they are co-occurring in one community. The graph has on its x-axis the increase in the frequency of the orange species. So here on the left, the orange species is rare in the community, and here on the right, the orange species is very frequent in the community. And we've got on the y-axis the growth rate of the orange species. And you can see that the orange species shows a decline in its growth rate as it becomes more frequent in the community. So this is potentially a very powerful mechanism for maintaining diversity, because firstly, it prevents any species from taking over the community, because as that species becomes more frequent, its population growth rate declines, and then other species are allowed to increase in frequency. You can think of it from the other side. What it also means is that when a species has just arrived in a community, just dispersed in, for example, here on the left of the graph, that species has a very high fitness and is able to invade the community, again, contributing to diversity. So normally people think about negative frequency dependent selection as something which might be imposed by, for example, resources. When an animal or plant starts to become very frequent in the community, it uses up all of its resources, and therefore its population growth rate declines, and other species which use other resources can increase in frequency. But we wondered whether it might apply to pollination. And to test the idea, we looked at pollination rate in a range of plant species that occurred in one community in a hectare of land in the Banhoek Valley. And we looked at the pollination rate of each of these species, which is surely a proxy for population growth rate, because, as I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, pollination is often important for seed production, and seeds are needed for population growth. So plants that receive more visits should have higher population growth rate. And so the y-axis here is the visits per flower in 30 minutes. And the x-axis is the frequency of the particular species that's being studied in the community. And you can see that as the species becomes more frequent in the community, more abundant, its visitation rate declines. In other words, it's not that great to be common from the perspective of pollination, because there just aren't enough individuals of your specialized pollinator to service your needs anymore. The pollinator abundance might be limited by, for example, territoriality if they're birds, or might be limited by nesting sites if they're bees. And so when the plant becomes very abundant, there just aren't enough pollinators to go around, and its pollination rate declines, its population growth rate declines, and other species are given a chance. So here's a potential mechanism for the maintenance of diversity in communities. I mentioned earlier that the Cape is one of those parts of the world that has very high numbers of threatened species. And this analysis of the red list of South Africa by Mathieu Roger shows that the main threats to these red listed species are, firstly, the blue segment of this pie chart, which is habitat loss. Secondly, invasive species. And thirdly, habitat degradation. In the remainder of this talk, I'm going to consider each of these three threats, but again, from the pollination perspective. Let's look at habitat loss and habitat fragmentation in the Cape. And if you know the Cape's morphology, you'll know that these highly fragmented regions over here and over here are the lowlands of the Cape. These are the slightly more nutrient-rich, shale-derived soils where renosterveld originally grew, and where today they are mainly wheat fields, canola fields, and vineyards. And you can see that the natural vegetation, which is the minute little green islands in a sea of agriculture, have been very greatly reduced. The wheat fields are a very inhospitable matrix for pollinators to live in, very low in diversity. And so we wondered whether the remaining little fragments of natural vegetation, such as Signal Hill and Lion's Head over here, we wondered whether those fragments were still viable from the perspective of pollination. And in fact, if you go to Signal Hill and you look at Pterygodium catholicum, populations on that hill, you'll find that none of the flowers are pollinated, and none of them produce any seed. And we wondered whether the absence of the oil-collecting bee from that region was the result of climatic conditions and, the geology of the area, for example. In other words, whether it was a natural phenomenon, a long-term natural phenomenon, or whether it was a recent change brought about by the fragmentation of the habitat. So to answer that question, we went to the herbariums, to the Bolus herbarium and to the Compton herbarium, and looked at very old specimens of Pterygodium catholicum. And we recorded the pollination rate on those ancient flowers. And you can do that because orchids are wonderful for looking at pollination rate. They have these pollen packets. And even in an old herbarium specimen, if you rehydrate that specimen in some warm water, you can see, are the pollen areas still there? Is there pollen on the stigma? You can actually see both of those things. And you can see that the pollination rate in the old specimens from the 1800s is considerably higher than in the new specimens from the 2000s. So it seems that, in fact, the pollinator has been extirpated on Signal Hill and Lion's Head as a result of the expansion of the city of Cape Town. And that occurred more or less here in the 1950s, the massive expansion of the city. Now, you might be wondering how this orchid can survive, how its populations can persist in the absence of seed production. And the answer is, of course, that they are reproducing vegetatively. So at the tips of their roots, they produce these bulbils, and the plant spreads clonally and produces these massive clones. So it can persist potentially for hundreds of years without any seed production. There might be population genetic consequences, which we haven't looked at, but from an ecological perspective, the plants are still there. But not all of them are as lucky as Pterogodium catholicum. So if you remember, there were a whole group of plants that were pollinated by the same bee, Rediviva perengei, and not all of them are able to reproduce clonally or vegetatively as this species can. One of the species that's not so lucky is, for example, Disparus cuculata, which I'll show you shortly, but there are a bunch of them. In this graph, you can see the decline in orchid populations if we compare the number of herbarium records before 1950 and after 1950. A value of 1 here means that there are as many records before as after 1950. And you can see that in general, the number of records has declined, but the decline is much greater for the non-clonal orchids shown with the filled bars than for the clonal orchids. So they seem to be particularly vulnerable to potentially habitat fragmentation and the loss of their pollinators. One of those species, as I mentioned, is Disparus cuculata, which still occurs in some places on the west coast, but is definitely absent today from Signal Hill and from Lion's Head, possibly as a result of the loss of its pollinator. You can see this herbarium specimen collected by Harry Bolus is clearly indicated as having come from Montes Leonis, from Lion's Head, and that species is definitely no longer there. Bird pollination is very well developed in the Cape region. There's something like 13% of the flora is bird pollinated. These iconic sugar birds are one of the important pollinators, and the others are the sunbirds. You can see here that the birds are very closely tied to the occurrence of their nectar-producing plants. This analysis by Scherk-Geertz shows the relationship between the bird atlas data and the protea atlas data. And you can see that the bird reporting rate is very closely matched with the occurrence of bird-pollinated proteas. You can find a similar pattern at a smaller scale using a more precise measurement, which is the availability of sugar per hectare. And you can calculate that by counting how many protea flowers there are and how much sugar there is per flower, and work out the number of grams of sugar per hectare. And you can see that as the number of grams of sugar per hectare increases, sugar bird abundance increases sharply, as shown on the right. The orange-breasted sunbird abundance shows a less pronounced increase, but that's partly because this analysis was using only the nectar-producing and bird-pollinated proteas, and the orange-breasted sunbirds feed on a range of other plants as well. They're not as closely tied to proteas as the Cape sugarbirds. So given their important role in the Cape flora, it's worrying to see that some of the nectar-feeding birds are very reluctant to move into urban areas. This data set, which is the Birds and Gardens data set, is data collected by amateur bird watchers who recorded what birds they saw in their gardens. And on the x-axis here, I'm showing the distance of that garden from natural vegetation. So 1 here means that this person's garden was located between 0 and 1 kilometers from a natural area, so right on the urban edge. And you can see that in those gardens, we quite often find malachite sunbirds. But as we move further into the city, 4, 5, 6 kilometers here, you're very unlikely to encounter, especially the malachite sunbird, which is the largest of the sunbirds here, and which has a very long beak to which several plant species in the Cape are specifically adapted. One of those is the candelabra plant, Brunsvigia orientalis. So this doesn't bode very well for the populations of that plant that occur in small urban conservation areas like Rondevlei or Cape Flats Nature Reserve, where these malachite sunbirds are absent, because the smaller beaked birds are not very effective pollinators of this species. And in fact, you can see that seed set declines as reserve size declines. Seed set can be low, in fact, quite often zero in small conservation areas, compared with quite substantial seed set where these large billed birds still occur. And we can see that has an effect on the demographic structure of the populations. Plant populations in small conservation areas quite often lack seedlings as a result of a lack of pollinators and a lack of seed production. So pollinators matter for this species. So moving on to the next threat for Cape plants, which is habitat degradation. And in the Cape, that essentially very often means fire frequency. Many parts of the Cape are being burnt too often and will be burnt even more often as conditions for the spread of fires become more and more favorable. We get longer periods of hot days, stronger winds, conditions that are favorable for the spread of fires. And so we were interested in how fire affects birds, in particular, those that are important pollinators. And you can see that in surveys before and after a fire, we see a decline in nectar-feeding bird diversity, we see a decline in nectar-feeding bird abundance. And that's to be expected because the proteas and the ericas on which many of these species depend require 5 or 6 years before they'll make their first flowers after a fire. So there's very little food in a landscape that's recently been burnt. And those birds need to migrate and move out of that area to find better pastures elsewhere. A possibly underappreciated form of habitat degradation is the effect of road traffic. We often place a lot of emphasis on the value of these road reserves, which are the little strip of vegetation that occurs between the road and the fence. Those areas often are not plowed, are not grazed, and there are many plant species there. But what about pollinators? It seems they don't do so well, especially the birds. We sampled erica pollination rate between 0 and 10 meters from the road and between 10 and 30 meters from the road, and then a little bit further away. And you can see very close to the road, between 0 and 10 meters, the pollination rate in ericas is much lower than further away. And quite often these road reserves are only 10 meters wide, so that doesn't bode very well for the conservation of plants in those regions, at least not for the bird-pollinated ones. Incidentally, ericas are great for doing these kind of surveys because they have these anther rings, which consist of fused anthers, and that ring gets ruptured by the beak of the bird, as you can see in the image below, during a visit. So you don't have to sit there and wait and count birds for days and days. You can just go through a population and record the pollination rate along a transect. You'll remember that invasive alien species are one of the ubiquitous threats in the Cape. One of the main culprits is this acacia in the center here. This is Acacia saligna, which is very abundant in the lowlands of the Cape. And we wondered what impact those invasions have on plant species that share the communities with that plant. So we looked at the pollination rate of all the species shown in this image in areas that were invaded by the acacia and compared it with areas that were not invaded by the acacia. And we found that quite often the pollination rate in the invaded areas was lower than in the uninvaded areas, as shown here for zygophyllum. For the community more generally, we found that you could predict the degree of impact by the alien on the pollination of the native plant based on how similar the alien was in its morphology and other floral traits to the alien. You can imagine the mechanism there. The more similar the alien is to the native species, or the native is to the alien species, the more likely they are to share a pollinator and the more likely they are to compete for that pollinator. The pollinators that were the most important here were the honeybees, which are, of course, then pulled away, as it were, by the acacia species, and that causes lower pollination rates as seen here in the native species. So most of the data I've shown you so far is what you might call correlative data. We've used natural variation in pollination rate or human-caused variation in pollination rate unintentional variation and looked at what effect that has on seed production, on the plants, etc. We haven't actually been in control of those variables. And to really test the importance of pollinators, you need to do an experiment. You need to remove pollinators. We did that for birds by excluding them from 20 by 20 meter plots using these bird exclusion cages that you could walk into. The cages were paired with control plots, which were open, and then with another type of control, which are these shade roofs shown here. They have a roof, which at least simulates the shading effect, but they are open on the sides, so the birds can still come in from the sides. And we replicated this little setup of 3 treatments multiple times across the landscape in Jonkershoek. And we looked at the effect of bird exclusion on several species in the community that are shown here, Proteas and Ericas in particular. We found that many of those species suffer lower pollination rates inside the cages compared with the shade treatment, and the shade treatment is the most logical comparison. You can see for Protea nerifolia, for Erica plucinetti, for example, but notice that there's relatively little effect here for Leucospermum lineara. Its seed set is not actually lower in the cage compared with the shade treatment. And we wondered whether this was the result of self-pollination, and then subsequently whether the self-pollinated seeds were actually viable. And our answer came when the entire valley burnt, as might be expected for fynbos, and we could look at seedling emergence after that fire. And we found that even for Leucospermum lineara, which is the one species in which seed set was not affected, we found fewer seedlings inside the cages compared with the shade treatment and the open treatment. And this suggested that, yes, indeed, despite the fact that the species was producing many seeds in the absence of pollinators, the seedlings were not emerging, possibly because they were inbred. So we need to do something about all of this. What solutions can we offer? So one example of a possible approach is the Ingungu project. This is a isiXhosa word, which means long-billed bird. And interestingly, it's also used to refer to royalty, and you can see why. So the aim of this project is to plant gardens of nectar-producing plants on school grounds within the city of Cape Town. And we hope that those nectar gardens, which are mostly filled with bird-pollinated plants, will act as stepping stones to create a migration corridor for birds that are attempting to cross the city. As you can see, the school learners are involved in all stages of the project, in the planting and the gardening, observing of birds. So it's essentially mainly also an education project. Here you can see it geographically. Our long-term aim is to create a link between the isolated Table Mountain National Park on the Cape Peninsula and the large natural areas in the Boland Mountains, which at the moment are barricaded by the city of Cape Town. When you get large fires on the Cape Peninsula, which can easily burn half of this area, those birds have to move somewhere else, and they need to cross the city in which there is very little nectar at the moment. So that's a long-term aim, to have gardens all along this transect shown here. At the moment, we're working mainly in the area highlighted by this rectangle and enlarged on the right. And in that area, we've got 8 schools at the moment, and they link the Table Mountain National Park with the Rondevlei National Park, or the Rondevlei Nature Reserve, through a series of stepping stones. At the moment, Kynman is managing the project. The project started as a project for Bongani Misi. It was his MSc project. He's currently the head of nature conservation for the city. His project was supervised by Shirk Geertz. And at the moment, Kynman Smith, together with Joel Simons, are very important in the progress of the project. Here you can see Joel interacting with some students in the field. So did it work? To answer that question, we monitored birds in these gardens over the, 7 years of the project's running. And we asked, did the abundance of bird species increase over this period? And did the probability of observing a sunbird increase as the gardens matured, as the plants grew bigger, more nectar was available. We also added more plants. And we saw that bird species richness did increase slightly over this period. The probability of seeing a sunbird increased from 20% to almost 60%. So there's quite a strong increase there. And it seems definitely like these gardens are bringing the birds back. What about the effect on the learners? To answer that question, we distributed questionnaires before and after the interaction with these students. And we also had control and experimental classes. So the control classes were unfortunately not involved in the project, and the experimental classes were involved in the project. And you can see that the participating classes with the red markers showed quite a strong increase in the questionnaire score compared with the non-participating classes, which showed a non-significant increase over time in questionnaire scores. And these questionnaires included questions about attitudes towards nature, also knowledge of nature. So it seems that the project then is hopefully having an impact both on the bird communities and on the human communities, and that in some way it's relinking people with nature and then also relinking birds with plants. So I've come to the end of my presentation, and I hope that you have come to agree with me that pollinators are important in the origin of species diversity in the Cape and then also in their maintenance, and that there are hands-on ways in which we can use pollinators to help in the conservation of Cape plants. So it remains for me to thank not only SAAB for this opportunity, but also for the sponsors who are shown here. Of course, there have been many co-authors on the papers that I've discussed today, and they have been credited on most of the slides individually. So thank you all for your input and for your support over the years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anton. That was fantastic. So the floor is open for questions. I'm just going to keep an eye on this chat box over here. But please feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions. Anton, I wanted to start off with a question comparing the pollinator specialization between the fynbos and the forest, because we've started to look at the forest trees a bit, and they're much less specialized, and they're directly adjacent to the fynbos. So is it just a growth form, or what would you say is your opinion?
Oh, that's very interesting. So I mean, the forest has been the forest has been neglected entirely, and I'm very glad that you are tackling it now, and I think you're very well placed to do so. You're based somewhere there in the forests of Knysna and Sarsveld. Yeah, I mean, if I think of those forest trees, you know, many of them are in the Celestraceae, for example. They've got those tiny little white flowers. Yeah, I mean, the forests are, from a phylogenetic and an historical perspective, completely different to the fynbos. But why should the degree of pollinator specialization be different? That's a difficult one to answer. I mean, they tend to be bigger individuals. Is that possibly part of the reason? I mean, can an oil bee pollinate all the hundreds of thousands of flowers on an individual forest tree? I don't know. Maybe that's a bad answer. I don't know. I think you should come up with the answer to that one. I wonder what's going on there. I mean, pollinator specialization is good if you're a rare plant, right? So if you're a rare plant in a community, you don't want to have the pollinator lose your pollen by visiting all kinds of other plant species on the way before it gets to another individual that belongs to the same species, right? So if conspecifics are very far apart with many other individuals in between, you're going to lose all your pollen before the pollinator gets to its destination. In forests, maybe there are fewer species, and therefore individuals of the same species are closer together. I mean, for example, the highly specialized plants classically are the orchids, right? They occur at very low densities with great distances in between. That oil bee is going to fly from the one to the other and ignore all the other plants in between. And the orchid has to have that specialization to get pollen transferred over those distances between the rare plants. Maybe if plants are more common, like your forest trees, more abundant in a community. I don't know, I'm hacking, but
yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. We
It's
were
really-
looking at the most common tree species, so I
We're
think
looking
you're
at the
on
more
the
common-
right track.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Okay, we've got a question from Binod Saradar. Can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you, sir.
Hi, thanks.
Thank you, sir. Sir, tell about some nocturnal pollination. Want to know nocturnal pollination on this, your concept, your idea for help and my guidance from you. Nocturnal pollination on any birds, for information for any birds, nocturnal pollination, or any nocturnal pollination or insect.
Yeah, I must say I haven't done much field work at night, and I probably should. So, I mean, there are a bunch of Cape plants that have flowers that suggest nocturnal pollination. The one lot are obviously moth-pollinated. So moth-pollinated plants are easy to recognize because they are typically white. They've got long nectar tubes. They've got small volumes of very concentrated nectar. And most importantly, they've got a strong scent, which is released at night. So, that what's called a syndrome of traits clearly identifies a species as being moth-pollinated. And I would guess that, there are quite a big group of Cape plants, most of which have not been studied, that are moth-pollinated. And then in the Cape, we've got another interesting group of nocturnally pollinated plants, and those are rodent-pollinated. And those species have quite different morphology. They very often flower close to the ground. They have large volumes of nectar, sometimes jelly-like nectar, which is too thick for an insect to slurp up, and you've got to lap it up, have it be a mammal like a mouse. And they've got a strong yeasty scent, which they release at night. So there are these two very different possibilities for nocturnal pollination. And both have been found in other parts of the world, especially Southwestern Australia and South America. But I'd be interested to know what you find.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Great, thank you very much. Jeroen, please, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Well, thanks, Anton. That was really cool. So my question is regarding you talked about the speciation of the orchids, and that it's following kind of that they move into new areas where there's geographically separated species of pollinators. And in those cases, would it be, if you're moving into a space where there's a new pollinator, I'm guessing those pollinators are already pollinating other flowers there. Are they generally generalists then, in that case, like, or pollinating more than one, or losing something and then taking something over? Because I'm guessing a pollinator can't be doing no pollinating and just waiting for you to arrive, right? Yeah, I'm just curious. Do you see that they, in those cases, are they generalists or pollinating more than one species or something like that?
Nice to hear from you again, Jeroen. It's been a long time.
Yeah.
Yes. So, you can only tell a small part of the story. So the bigger part of the story is that, yes, the plants tend to be highly specialized on the bees. So each plant species tends to have a single bee as its pollinator. But of course, the bees have to visit several plant species to, make it through the whole season and to obtain enough oil as well as nectar. So the bees are relatively unspecialized compared to the plants, and the plants are highly specialized, typically with a single pollinator. So a big part of the story I didn't tell regarding the oil collecting bees is that they visit another family of plants besides the orchids, and that is the Scrophulariaceae, the snapdragons, which also secrete oil, especially Diacia and Hemimeris. And so, those species alone can probably sustain a bee in a particular area. And so, the bees are not depending entirely on the orchids. The community exists in the absence of those orchids. And if an orchid disperses into a new area, yes, there can be a pre-existing community of bees in that area that depends on other plant species for its persistence.
So, yeah, thank you. That's interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Here in the chat box is a question by Jeff Ollerton. asking whether you are optimistic that you can link up those two major reserves using school gardens. Are they large enough?
Yeah, that's a good question. And something that one would want to do, obviously, is to have a long record of bird abundance and diversity in the nature reserves as well as in the gardens. And that's quite difficult to achieve. But, I'd say, yes, I am optimistic that it can work. We're seeing the birds in the gardens on the way to the nature reserve. So I think it can only help. Something that I think is going to be important is to enlarge the size of the gardens, to increase the density of plants, because some species, for example, sugarbirds, have large bodies and have large nectar requirements. And at the moment, the gardens are not fulfilling their needs, I don't think. So increasing the numbers of plants and perhaps also, trying to plant specifically proteas, which the sugarbirds are more interested in, that might make some difference. I feel relatively optimistic about it. I'm always so encouraged when I go to a garden and I don't only see the plants and the students working with the plants, but actually see birds on those plants. And then you really feel like, wow, this was just a bare field of grass or tarmac, and now suddenly there's all this life here. So, that's, the data that we present on, there's an increase in bird abundance or there's an increase in questionnaire scores for a student, those are quite cold facts, but the sort of personal experience of going to a place like this and seeing a bird in that sort of gang-ridden, densely populated urban area, that's what's uplifting and gives me hope. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Question by Jaco Stoffberg. Great conservation project, well done. How many species are you planting in the school gardens? Are you selecting plants mostly for nectar volumes?
Thanks, Jaco. Also a long time no see. So I guess a garden on average might have 20 plant species in it. And the plants were selected very carefully, starting with a list of species that are indigenous to the Cape Flats, which is, quite a difficult task to achieve, to find out what those plant species are or what they were historically. Then from that list, to make a smaller list of those that are bird pollinated. And often that's done again based on syndromes. As I explained before, moth pollinated plants are white and have small nectar volumes and scent. Well, bird pollinated plants typically have red flowers, large nectar volumes, dilute nectar, and no scent. And using those traits, you can identify species that would potentially attract birds. And so we use those criteria. So yes, those are the plants that we chose, ones with large nectar volumes, no scent. Quite often they need a perch where the bird can sit. And so those species we focused on, and then specifically tried to get plants that would flower in different seasons. So the aloes, for example, in winter, and many of the bulb plants in spring, etc. So those were some of the criteria. And we are mindful of the fact that the birds are surely moving pollen. So we don't want birds to move pollen of strange hybrids and horticultural varieties out of the small conservation areas or from the gardens into national parks. So we're very particular about the seed sources that we use to produce these plants for the gardens, trying to use locally sourced seed, which again is quite a challenge. Thank you.
Thanks. But I think in general, South Africa is doing quite well with their locally indigenous nurseries, or they seem to be improving.
Well, we've had organizations like Felt and Flora and Botanical Society, promoting growing indigenous plants for a very long time. So we're getting there, but it's the concept of what constitutes indigenous that needs to be refined even more. So many people are happy to plant any South African plant because they think that's indigenous. The question is, what's indigenous to your biome, to your community where you live? And that's not the same.
Yeah.
Not the same plants in
All
George
right,
and Kate.
I'm going to take this question from Claudia Rodriguez, and then I'll take, then we can take Stepan's question as well. So Claudia asked, the question is related with the Sunbird project that you were talking about at the end. What about the reproductive requirements of these birds? How to solve this part?
Yeah, we are probably too plant focused, and we need to get a bit more bird focused. We do find sunbird nests, even at the schools. So the sunbirds, you know, for example, would like to nest in trees. And so, you know, even though the trees are seldom nectar producing for birds, and seldom have bird pollinated flowers, it's important to have a few trees around for birds to nest in. And we need to think about that as well. You know, we've taken quite a simplistic approach, which is to look at the data that I presented, which shows that the more nectar you get in a landscape, or the more sugar in a landscape, the more birds there are. So let's add sugar and we'll get more birds. That's been quite a simplistic approach, and it doesn't think about the other requirements of the birds, such as nesting sites. And of course, they also feed on insects and feed insects to their chicks in the nest. So there's more to it. And of course, the gardens, you know, do also increase insect abundance and the abundance of other food types for birds. But it's a very good question. We need to focus a bit more on the birds and their needs.
Thanks. Stepan, please go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you for the presentation. It was very nice. We are also working on sunbirds mainly in Cameroon, and I wanted to just ask about the this study on these bird gardens, the last one, which is quite nice, and also these gardens are quite nice idea. But I was wondering how it is with the migration of sunbirds, especially seasonal migrations, because I expect that even in Cape there are some quite big migrations by sunbirds looking for some new flowering areas, or the flowering areas change during the year. So actually these two natural reserves are not so far from each other, let's say. So if you somehow have also some data on bird ringing, or somehow to consider this effect that they migrate, probably you are much more expertise in this, but how far they migrate, just looking for food plants during the seasons and so on.
Right. You know what? I think actually Anina is better placed to answer that question than I am. She has been ringing some birds. I don't know. Have you got some data from those orange-breasted sunbirds yet? How much they move? My feeling is some of them not so much, and then sometimes you do see long movements. What have you picked up?
They're quite a mystery. They do seem to stay in one place quite a lot. But there are also, there's a few records where they've moved longer distances. But I think there's just not enough data to really say for sure. I'm definitely not the expert, but I have heard people that ring the sunbirds a lot, that say that they ring them and then they just disappear and we don't know where to. So it might be, but it's definitely not very predictable movements. If there is, you know, seasonal movements, it's not like you can predict they're going from that mountain to that mountain or whatever.
Yes.
Sugarbirds, yeah, there's also evidence of them moving longer distances, but again, not very predictable.
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear in places like Jonkershoek that they're absent for a long period, you know, during the dry months. And then suddenly the proteus start flowering and they're all there and they start setting up territories and breeding. You know, and then also that they're not there after a fire is very clear. Yeah, and they're quite big-bodied. There have been some long-distance ring recoveries, but I mean, it's not always something that people encourage. But it would be very nice to get some radio tracking data, especially within the urban areas, and to see how much they move around between these gardens. Hopefully, the technology will improve and we can get small enough transmitters, but at the moment that's still a limitation because they're very small birds. Some of the sunbirds, especially, you know, what do they weigh? Only now 14 grams or something.
No, the sunbirds are 7 grams, 6 grams.
Some of the smallest one. I mean, the sugarbirds are probably 14.
Sugarbirds are 40, yeah.
They could be used for radio tracking.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for that question. And then here's a question by Calvin Francis that asks, do we know what specific human activity caused the decline of oil bees within the Lionhead area?
I would say it's the reduction in the size of the area. So, that's classical kind of island biogeography theory, that you have a smaller area and the probability of a species going extinct in a smaller area is greater than a larger area because there are smaller populations of that species. And so the normal fluctuations that you get in abundance of the species over time is more likely to take that species right down to zero and for it to be lost. And now it's an isolated area, so they can't recolonize that easy. So, Signal Hill and Lions Head would have been part of an extensive ecosystem that covered the city bowl, those areas all of the same geology, and would have had the Nosterveld vegetation. So you left with a very small little ecosystem. Yes, Table Mountain is nearby, but Table Mountain is mostly sandstone, and Signal Hill, the base of Signal Hill at least, and Lions Head are richer soils, which are suitable for the bees to potentially nest in. And so, you've got to have not only lots of habitat, but lots of the right sort of habitat nearby. And I think most of the favorable habitat, which would have been the lowlands, is now city. So I'd say essentially habitat fragmentation and the reduction in the size of the area, which affected the pollinators because they're mobile and because they have lower population sizes. They were affected before the plants. I hope that answers your question. It's not, a deterministic answer. So I can't tell you they went extinct because of this reason. It's stochasticity in the sense that it's an unpredictable loss resulting only from small population sizes and what you might call ecological drift.
Thank you. Kerun also asked if there is data on how far birds will fly in search for nectar, which we've
kind
answered.
of covered, but I think there's some very good studies on hermit hummingbirds in Central America and South America, and I think they've led the way, shown us what we should be doing. They show they show that the movements are quite extensive in the hermit hummingbird, certainly.
And then Claudia Rodriguez asked, what are the expectations for pollination interactions in terms of climate change for this area? Which can be the most important effects?
We don't know enough. I mean, some of the effects that people have considered in other parts of the world are that plants and pollinator phenology might be disrupted. So, for example, in alpine regions, with climate warming, plants are emerging from the snow earlier and are flowering earlier, and then the pollinators have not woken up yet. I don't think that kind of thing is going to be that common here, but certainly some of the effects that I think we will be seeing is more frequent fires, which will strongly affect the pollinator community. For example, the oil bees are more abundant soon after a fire. Birds are less abundant soon after a fire. So fire frequency is going to have some big effects. And then droughts. So, one of the main implications of climate change in the Cape is more frequent droughts. And we've had some very severe droughts here. Cape Town was one of the first global cities to almost run out of water. Those kind of droughts very strongly affect, for example, annual plants, which just don't flower at all. So some parts of the southwestern Cape are very, very rain dependent. And you wonder what happens to oil collecting bees, for example, or any of the more specialized pollinators. If they emerge in a year that's dry and their particular oil or nectar or pollen producing plants are not present, can they know that it's a dry year before they emerge? Can they remain dormant? We don't know those answers yet.
Speaking of the oil collecting bees, here's a question from Nathan Finkelstein. Any ideas of the oil's composition? Are they fixed oils, glycerides, or volatile oils, terpenes? Is the oil merely an attractant, or is the oil biotransformed in the pollinator?
They are triglycerides. They're not very volatile. and they are remarkably similar in chemical structure between unrelated oil-secreting species that use the same bee. So I mentioned earlier that the Scrophulariaceae also secrete oil, and not only the orchids, and the oil produced by these species is practically identical. So it's not just a attractant, it's actually the resource that the bees are looking for. It's only the female bees. They collect the oil, it's very high in energy. They mix it with pollen, they make a little bread, which is the food source for the larvae in the underground nest. So it's more than an attractant. It's not like the situation with the scent rewarding orchids of Central America, where the bees just collect the scent. This is actually a food reward, energy-rich reward.
Excellent, thank you. And then Kenneth Oberlander has a question. In the one slide, the proboscis length of your pollinators across multiple populations seem to be a bit longer than the relevant floral tube. Speaking from entomological ignorance, is this normal?
Hi, Kenneth. So the matches and mismatches of tubes and tongues is a very interesting question. And again, you know, what you are seeing is a very small part of a bigger picture. There's a community of long tube flowers at each site, even though there's a single fly species. And some of the species in that community might be leading the race. So in some of those populations, for example, where the fly's got a really long proboscis and the floral tubes are quite a bit shorter, I think what's happening there is that the fly is being chased along by a different plant species. And quite often it's Babiana tubulosa, which I didn't show, that leads the race. And then the Laparusias and other species are a bit behind, if you want to say it like that. Incidentally, what that means in terms of coevolution is quite interesting, because if the tube is substantially shorter than the proboscis, you are, effectively going to get a situation where the plant can no longer act as a selective force on the fly. The flies are able to drain the nectar out of all of the flowers. So, in a scenario where there's a severe mismatch, you actually do not expect to find coevolution occurring. It's only where the traits are relatively well matched that coevolution can occur. I hope that answers your question.
All right, thanks. Another question by Calvin Francis. The conservation project with the nectar corridors. Are there specific locations within the school where a garden is placed, such as in an area of the school that's located further from the roads, where there is a lot of noise, for example? Does noise pollution affect the migration in the corridor, or is it simply that they need the land and flowers for food or rest or other activities?
Yes, so we thought exactly like you in the beginning, which is, let's place the gardens in the quietest part of the school grounds, somewhere behind the rugby fields, because that's where the birds will be happiest. And then we took a landscape architect with us, and he said that's never going to work, because the gardens are just going to get neglected there and get overrun by grasses. Put it right at the entrance to the school where the headmaster sees it every morning, and then it'll get watered and cared for. And he was absolutely right. So we've often done that. And it doesn't seem to make a huge difference to the birds. The birds are often there very early in the morning before school starts. And even when everyone's in class, the birds are around. So yeah, they might get a little bit, scared off by people at certain times of day, but it's still better to have the garden close to the school, and also for safety reasons. It's better to have it, in a place where it's visible. I hope that answers your question.
And don't forget to mention the fences that you need to put up to protect the gardens from the soccer balls.
Yeah, we use aloes for that sometimes.
All right. All right. I don't see any other new questions in the chat box. So if there's anybody else with a question, please raise your hand so we don't miss you. Or just unmute yourself if you don't know. If you can't find the hand raising tool. Here's a question. Claudia Rodriguez asks, with hummingbird gardens in Mexico, we observed that not only hummingbirds, but bumblebees and butterflies diversity, even granivorous birds, increased greatly. Did you have any similar experience?
Yes, so the graphs that I showed of bird diversity was not just nectar-feeding bird diversity, it was the diversity of all bird species. So it's interesting to, think of the bird community as a whole, and it's something we definitely need to do more of, to look at the response of the community and community composition to the presence of gardens. So yeah, you plant plants and it does a lot more than just attract sunbirds or sugarbirds. They provide nesting material for other bird species, they produce seed for other bird species, they are host plants for insects. So yeah, plants are the keystone species that gets the ecosystem going.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? Just checking questions here in the chat box. There's one just to say thank you and I wish you best in the rugby final.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Okay, I hope that I don't see any hands raised. And I don't see any other new questions in the chat box. So I think that's it. But it was a really great discussion, this question session. So thank you very much, Anton, for your willingness to field all these questions.
Thank you very much for asking them.
Excellent. All right, yes, I don't think I've missed anything. So I'd like to close us off. Thank you very much, Anton, for your time and for this excellent presentation. The diversity of plants and pollination systems in South Africa just remains astounding. And I hope you find some new, a lot more interesting things to do. And good luck with all the projects that you have ongoing, especially with the schools. That's not always easy, but yeah, it's going to be worthwhile. So I see a lot of thank yous and hand claps around, so you can go and look at the chat at the end as well. Anything else from you, Anton?
That's it, except to say thank you very much for the opportunity and thank you for your attention.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody for attending. Last thing, the SAAB conference that is happening in January. Registration is open. It will take place 7 to 11 January. If I have got the dates right now, I hope. It's in Richards Bay and it's hosted by the University of Zululand. And registration is already open, so please go to the SAAB website to find details for that. All right. Elizabeth, or someone tell me if I missed anything.
Thanks. Nothing from my side.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and hope you have a nice evening further.